Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. We will now continue chapter 41 with part 4. Since Will's inner vibration was in no way a match to their destination, the flight was rather rocky. But as the darkness gave way, and the dim gray interior of Nathan's dungeon began to appear, Will knew they'd surmounted the first hurdle of their mission. The scene was hazy and remained so. This must be the twilight, he thought. He could feel the tension, his body resisting the call of his mind to join it. Then suddenly, he felt a jolt, and the room before him snapped into focus. After a quick glance around the dark chamber, which verified the accuracy of Daniel's description, Will fortified his body, toughening his hide and putting spring into his legs, then launched himself from the shadowy corner toward the guards surrounding his sweetheart. Clearly, their arrival had gone unnoticed, for he managed to make it halfway to the men before they saw him and cried out in alarm. The guard tethered to Emily stood up from his chair, but held his position, while the other two, one step behind the other, moved to intercept him. As Will heard the low-pitched thump of Charlotte's crossbow loosing its deadly projectile, followed by a shriek from the far side of the room, he lifted his sword to strike the lead sentry. His opponent caught sight of the weapon and raised his arms just in time to avoid a lethal blow, receiving instead a yawning gash across both of his forearms. Emily, seated on the hard stone bench, her sleep-starved eyes half open, seemed to realize her liberators had arrived, for she tried to stand. Her legs failed her, however, and she collapsed back onto the bench. The wounded guard, blood spilling freely from his arms, stumbled to one side. Will then thrust his sword at the man's companion, now within his reach, driving the blade deep into his upper abdomen. The impaled drifter let out a deep moan and dropped to his knees, clutching Will's arm with his hands. The man was clearly gifted, for, though mortally wounded, his grip was iron. "Will!" he heard Charlotte shout, as he struggled to free himself and his blade. Turning his head, he saw that one of the men stationed by the door was now bearing down on him, while another was headed for Charlotte, who held her hefty weapon like a bat, ready to swing. The third guard lay motionless on the ground, his body, pierced by Charlotte's quarrel, now began to disappear. Will summoned his strength and pulled the sword from his dying foe, but before he could wield it, the charging assailant reached him, wrapping his arms around Will's body as he slammed into him. The collision drove Will back a few steps. He kept his feet, but lost his sword, dropping it to the ground. Held firmly in the powerful henchman's vice-like embrace, Will saw the guard leash to Emily look down at the fallen weapon lying at Will's feet. As he stepped forward and started to reach for it, Will lifted his legs, bringing his knees close to his body, and thrust both feet into the guard's chest, sending him stumbling backwards into the seat of his chair. At the same time, Will threw the back of his head into the face of the drifter who held him, breaking the man's hold, as well as his nose. Now free, Will spun and struck his adversary in the jaw with his fist. A heavy blow landed squarely. The villain's knees buckled, and he slumped to the hard ground in a heap. The tethered guard rose from the chair and once again made for the sword. Will stepped on the blade with one foot and kicked him with the other, landing his foot in the man's stomach, doubling him over. Snatching up his weapon from the floor, Will shot a quick glance toward Charlotte to see how she fared. Her opponent had managed to catch hold of the crossbow as she swung it, and was now trying to wrench it from her hands. She let go of the stock with one hand, drew one of the quarrels from her belt, and planted the relic in his arm. The man howled and released her weapon. Charlotte delivered a quick kick to his groin, dropping him to his hands and knees. Then, before he could rise, she stabbed him again, this time burying the bolt between his shoulder blades. The man who'd first met Will's blade, his arms cut to the bone, made no attempt to re-enter the fight. His face turned white as the blood streamed from his wounds, forming a widening pool at his feet. He swooned and sank to his knees, a blind stare in his eyes, then slowly faded from the room. Emily then seemed to muster some energy. She called out Will's name and tried to stand. The guard bound to her had collected himself and now looked at his charge. He began to move toward her, but Will intervened, leaping forward and striking the side of the man's head with the flat of his blade, sending him to the floor. "Sit down," Will shouted to Emily. He then stepped forward and raised his sword, aiming his blow at the tether, which lay stretched across the bench beside her. But as he brought down the blade, he suddenly realized that what joined Emily to her guard was not a rope, but a heavy chain. Sparks flew as the steel deflected off the iron links onto the stone. Will struck again, then again. "It's a chain," he yelled to Charlotte, striking once more. A chain, with manacles at each end. He should have noticed it immediately. It should have been obvious. But in the frenzy of battle, all of his attention had been focused on his enemies. "What should we do?" Charlotte asked him, taking advantage of the lull to cock and load her weapon. "Keep watching the door," Will told her, as he continued hacking at the unyielding iron. It was heartbreaking. Everything had gone as planned, and yet now, because of this one unforeseen detail, their situation appeared hopeless. Perhaps, despite what Jeremy had said, if he and Charlotte both took hold of Emily, they could drag her, the artifact, and the unwilling guard back to Wysteria. What other option did they have? Will turned to inform Charlotte of the new plan, when the door flew open, and his old adversary, Anton, flanked by two more guards, young men who looked familiar, rushed into the room. "You," said the talented brute, clearly shocked to see Will there. You're a long way from home, boy. And that concludes part 4 of chapter 41. And we'll be back right away with the conclusion of chapter 41.